Bruce Gordon. During the 1960s, I flew air defense scrambles in defense of the United States, and I had about 15 active air scrambles against unknowns. Sometimes those turned out to be Russians, sometimes they were something else, but in an active air scramble, we were in the alert hangar, usually with a fire pole to get down to the aircraft, and with our flight suits on, we had set up the planes, the cockpit was all cocked, as we said. We'd gone in there and set up all our switches. We had our parachutes there, our helmets there, our gloves there. The switches were all on the way we wanted them. And we'd then go back up to the alert crew quarters, and we could read magazines, watch movies. We didn't have television back then. And we could have meals, we could sleep. But we could be off the ground in 5 minutes or less. We were usually less getting off the ground. If they wanted to upgrade our scramble to a hotter status, they would tell us to go on battle stations. Battle stations meant that we were in the cockpits, ready to go. So we'd run down, climb in the plane, be right there and waiting for them to call on the loudspeaker to scramble. And we could get off in 2 minutes. If it was a colder kind of scramble, we would say be on 15-minute alert, where we could go around the quarters fairly well. We could go take lessons in classes, ground school training, something like that. We'd be on 15-minute status. And we'd be sometimes on 30-minute status, which meant we could go anywhere on the base. We carried a radio, and we could go to the base exchange or whatever, or even go home if it was close by. What I'd like to talk to you about today is a really cold scramble, when we were not even on 30-minute alert. We were off duty when we got scrambled. A really cold scramble from off duty. Our main base was at Elmendorf Air Force Base outside of the big city of Anchorage. Here we kept our spare airplanes, and the aircraft could have maintenance. The pilots could get training, and when the planes were ready, the pilots would fly them out to our other remote bases, which were at King Salmon, Galena, and Eielson. There we would sit alert for about 5 days and then return back to Elmendorf, where we would get a few days off. Each of our fighter bases was paired with a GCI, ground-controlled intercept, radar site, which had about a 200-mile radar range and could scramble us to meet any incoming bombers. The site at Elmendorf, though, had a reduced range because of all the mountains around it. To make up for this, for years we had had another radar site along the Gulf of Alaska near the Canadian border, which would reach far out into the Gulf of Alaska, giving us coverage out there. However, this radar site had just been decommissioned to save money. My wingman and I had just got back from 5 days on alert at Galena, and we were given 2 days off before we would fly out to another 5 days at King Salmon. So we went downtown in Anchorage, walked around for a while, went into the bars, had a few drinks, and got back to our barracks at about 1 o'clock in the morning. At about 6 o'clock in the morning, the telephone in the barracks hall began to ring. And it rang, and it rang. But we were off duty. Why should I answer the phone? There was nobody else in the building. So I got up, stumbled out, and answered the phone. "Captain Gordon," he said, "there's a Tu-95 Russian Bear coming up the Aleutian Chain. He was intercepted by our fighters out of King Salmon, but they're tracking him, but they're running low on fuel. The bear is still coming toward Anchorage. Get out there and scramble. I said, sir, just a minute, we're off duty. He said, there are 2 F-106s fully armed and ready to go sitting on the ramp. Get out there and scramble. I said, yes, sir. I ran to my wingman and yelled at him, scramble, there's a Russian bear heading this way. He said, we can't scramble, we're off duty. I said, forget that, there's 2 planes waiting for us and maintenance men are headed our way. Let's go. Getting him out of bed was hard, but we were soon in our car and headed out to the ramp. We went into personal equipment, grabbed our helmets and parachutes and gloves and all that, and headed out driving this rental car across the ramp. There were no maintenance men in sight as they brought the car to a screechy halt behind our planes. We grabbed our chutes and helmets and ran out. I could see there were intake covers and lots of red flags hanging all over the airplane. I ran around the plane pulling out the safety pins, removing intake covers, grabbed a ladder, put it up to the canopy, opened the canopy, and took a look at the forms. The aircraft forms showed the aircraft was fully armed, but was on a big red X, unflyable, for no maintenance pre-flight performed. Well, I knew that. Everything else was good. About this time, one master sergeant showed up, and he began working fast, launching our 2 planes. We started our engines, and in a few moments we had to close the cockpits and were taxiing out and calling the tower. Elmendorf Tower, scramble 2 F-106s. Roger, replied the tower, you are cleared for takeoff. We pulled rapidly onto the runway, ran up our engines, released brakes, lit the afterburners, and in a few seconds we were airborne. I contacted the radar controller and he turned us south over the Gulf of Alaska. He told us that the Tu-95 Bear had been coming up the Aleutian Chain, and the fighters from King Salmon had finally run low on fuel and they had to go back. Nobody had contact with the Bear now. It was somewhere in the Gulf of Alaska. The Bear was probably an electronic intelligence aircraft looking for holes in our radar coverage. He probably had heard that we had decommissioned a radar site and was wondering if we had left a hole in our radar coverage. Well, we had a hole and he had found it. Our controller turned us south and said, search all over. We looked at our radar and by golly, I picked up a target. The target was more than 20 miles away on a southeasterly course at moderate speed and moderate altitude. I plugged my F-106 in the afterburner and went scooting after him. I closed in on him fairly quickly. Finally, I saw him. Darn! It wasn't a Tu-95 Bear. It was a civilian airliner heading from Anchorage down to Seattle. We turned back and resumed our search for the Bear, but couldn't find him. When we landed back at Elmendorf, I felt we had done a good job, but no good deed goes unpunished. A day later, an officer came up to me and said, Captain, you violated regulations. You flew an airplane on a Red X for no pre-flight. You'll have to account for this. I turned around and walked off. I was in trouble again, but at least I had shown the spirit of attack.